Over the last 30 years, the most cherished video games of old have spiraled into long-lasting franchises, telling stories through sequels and prequels that expanded on the tales that captivated players in their original releases. Many of these series evolved into legends of their own, creating a timeline of lore that kept their avid communities entrenched in the game's world. Few sparked more interest, more mystery, and above all, the imagination of the gaming world than The Legend of Zelda. This tale began back in 1987 with the release of The Legend of Zelda for the NES. It went on to become a landmark for many reasons, but its plot wasn't among them. The only story elements came in the form of a brief text paragraph that explained you were on a quest to save Zelda from an evil being known as Ganon. If you managed to delve into the game's manual, you were treated to a bit more narrative, like why Ganon, wielding the Triforce of Power, invaded Hyrule, seeking the Triforce of Wisdom. When Zelda caught wind of the invasion, she dispatched her nursemaid Impa to find a hero valiant enough to save Hyrule, but not before breaking the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 fragments and hiding them. Link eventually claimed these fragments and saved the kingdom and its young princess. A little over a year later, Nintendo released a sequel, The Adventure of Link. From the game's introduction and manual, we learned that after Ganon was destroyed in the first game, Link set out to find the Triforce of Courage in order to awaken a slumbering Princess Zelda. Not the same princess from the original game, but an ancestor from an era long past. Meanwhile, Ganon's minions were out for Link's blood, which could be used to revive the Demon King. A few more narrative elements were sprinkled throughout the game, but much of the plot was again tucked away in the game's manual. The backstory here painted a broader picture of the Kingdom of Hyrule and its history, bringing to light a tale that transpired long before either of the two games. It felt like there was more to the chronology than a few lines of text. Nevertheless, Hyrule planted the indelible thought that there was more to it than initially met the eye, igniting the imaginations of countless travelers who would brave its monster-ridden plains. The next game in the series proved to be a catalyst. It broke the serialized nature of the franchise and was branded as a prequel. The new adventure put a heavier emphasis on the story, one which developed over the course of the game. Unlike its predecessors, players experienced the story simply by playing the game. A Link to the Past established much of the foundational lore the rest of the series would eventually draw upon, like the creation of Hyrule, the Triforce, the Master Sword, and the origins of Ganon. Given the information available, the chronology of lore in the Zelda universe appeared simple enough. However, Nintendo's decision to make a prequel, rather than continue in a serialized format, marked the start of a perplexing trend. Zelda took a departure from the norm in Link's Awakening. While it did little to expand upon the Hyrule lore, it was a touching side story that gave us a rare glimpse into Link's personality. The legendary hero had set off to hone his skills after defeating Ganon in A Link to the Past, but on his return voyage, a maelstrom destroyed his ship. Link washed ashore on the mysterious Koholint Island, where a young girl named Marin rescued the lad and nursed him back to health. The girl bore a striking resemblance to Zelda, one of the game's few connections to the rest of the series. Link learned that the only way to leave the island was to wake the Windfish, a protective deity slumbering inside a giant egg atop the island's tallest mountain. However, Link's freedom ultimately came at a high price. The entirety of Koholint was but a dream of the Windfish, and awakening the creature would spell the end of the island and all its inhabitants. It was an emotional tale with a depressing conclusion that remains one of the most memorable in the series. Though Link's Awakening was more of a side story, it potentially held an important clue for theorists to piecing the series together. The ship that Link was sailing on bore a striking resemblance to the ship introduced in later games, suggesting those games might share a connection. Distant association through shared imagery like this later formed a good number of the binding threads that eventually pieced the games together. It was 5 long years before we returned to Hyrule. In 1998's Ocarina of Time was presented as an origin story, chronicling the events that had been partially described in previous games. A young boy named Link set out with the means to stop the evil Ganondorf from claiming the Triforce with the aid of Princess Zelda, but their actions unintentionally triggered a sequence of events that ultimately led to the downfall of Hyrule. In the aftermath, Link gathered the courage to travel between 2 time periods in order to awaken 7 sages and obtain the strength to defeat Ganondorf once and for all. The hero of Time's adventure provided deeper insight into the series' mythos. 3 goddesses created Hyrule, and when they departed, they left behind the sacred Triforce, a relic that could grant one's wishes. In order to protect such a powerful item from falling into the wrong hands, it was hidden away in the sacred realm. Ganondorf, king of the Gerudo, lusted for this divine relic, and eventually learned of its resting place. For timeline theorists, the battle to stop Ganondorf from conquering Hyrule and ultimately seal him away in the sacred realm appeared to fall in line with what was outlined in A Link to the Past. In the months leading up to its release, Nintendo touted Ocarina of Time as a Genesis tale, and this was further supported by both the game's narrative and instruction manual. No one realized it then, but Ocarina of Time's ending later served as the basis for one of the biggest plot twists in the series. In the game's finale, Zelda decided to send the time-traveling hero back to his original time period. The implications of this action weren't fully realized until later on. That didn't stop some from speculating. Given the facts, it wasn't difficult for fans to piece together the timeline. The Legend of Zelda was followed by Zelda 2, a direct sequel. A Link to the Past was a prequel to the NES classics, which was then followed by Link's Awakening. In an interview conducted in Nintendo Power, series creator Shigeru Miyamoto revealed what he had deemed to be the official order of The Legend of Zelda. This remark flew in the face of what fans had speculated. For the first time, there was controversy amongst those who believed in an established timeline, and this one quote would spark a decades-long debate about the tales of Hyrule. The plot would soon thicken. Like its name implies, The Legend of Zelda could be just that, a legend, a series of self-contained stories that drew from the motifs established by its predecessors. Many other franchises ended up following this template to give greater storytelling freedom to its writers and producers. By the early 90s, Nintendo had successfully built a franchise around Link and Princess Zelda. With video games slowly becoming a mainstream medium of entertainment, some players began holding these serialized stories to the same standard as those told in books, TV shows, and even film sagas. And Zelda was not spared. In hindsight, the creators of Hyrule failed to anticipate this from some in their newfound fanbase. Some of the series' most avid fans built on the legend, dedicating themselves to piecing together what they perceived as threads that tied the story of every Zelda game together in an overarching chronology, a timeline. These fans were eventually branded as timeline theorists. 2 years later, Nintendo released a second Zelda game for the Nintendo 64, Majora's Mask. The opening sequence of the game revealed that several months after Ocarina of Time, Link was drawn into an alternate dimension called Termina, while searching for a friend. This strange world was being terrorized by the Skull Kid, a mischievous forest imp from Ocarina of Time who had stolen a mask, granting him incredible powers. Link only had 3 days to stop the real culprit, Majora's Mask itself, before it brought the moon crashing down into the surface. Like Link's Awakening, this direct sequel was more of a side story, but it served as an important clue for theorists who wanted to decipher a potential timeline. Majora's Mask took place after Link was returned to his original period by Zelda at the end of Ocarina of Time. This suggested to theorists that the events that led up to the point where Link was sent back in time were erased from history and were replaced by what transpired in Majora's Mask. A few months after Majora's Mask, we were treated to not one, but two simultaneous Zelda releases, 2001's Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages for the Game Boy Color. Link was investigating the Triforce in Hyrule Castle one day when he was whisked away by the Divine Relic to the distant lands of Holodrum and Labrynna. Evil forces terrorized each land, and Link set out to restore order before they completely fell into chaos. Behind the scenes, Ganon's followers used the turmoil to their advantage and attempted to revive their fallen master. Many elements within the game's story pointed towards other games in the series, like the ship and the ending bearing an uncanny resemblance to the one in Link's Awakening, and timeline theorists sprang into action. Since the Triforce was unified and in Hyrule Castle, the only two places where Seasons and Ages seemed to make sense were either after the adventure of Link or A Link to the Past, the only other times where the Triforce was complete. Since the game's placement in the theorized timeline was far from conclusive, it strengthened the case against the existence of such a timeline. Many believed that Nintendo was just making up the chronology as it went along. Nintendo re-released A Link to the Past in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance, which included a multiplayer game called Four Swords. This new version of the classic Super Nintendo game contained revised dialogue that amended terms like wise men with sages, a more direct reference to Ocarina of Time. Nintendo claimed it updated the terminology in this version so it had a stronger connection with previous games. Additionally, Four Swords turned out to be a whole new game with a self-contained story. Link was on a quest to stop an evil wind mage named Vati, who was freed from his prison and was bent on destroying Hyrule. The plot appeared very simple and ambiguous enough that it could take place almost at any time by those who intended to build a Zelda timeline. However, series producer Eiji Aonuma made a comment that Four Swords was the oldest story in the series, and it took place even before Ocarina of Time. Until that comment, timeline theorists usually place the game at the end of their chronology.